Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with our feature, Reinhard Hardigan, who died recently at the age of 105. Reinhard Hardigan was the last of the German U-boat commanders of World War II. U-boat is short for Unterseeboot or undersea boat. And in 1942 he did much of his patrolling across the east coast of the United States. It's sent for his first patrol near New York City. He used the Ferris wheel at Coney Island as a landmark. He was probably the first German military man to see the United States mainland during World War II, and his submarine U-123 destroyed freighters and tankers across the eastern seaboard from New York City to the Florida coast. The U-boats were especially effective in the earlier phases of the war until their targeted ships began trailing in convoys with escort carriers and aircraft became a significant weapon against them. Here's the BBC4 Last Word with Matthew Bannister on Reinhard Hardigan.
Kapitänleutnant Hardegen, dessen Boot unmittelbar vor den Toren New Yorks operierte.
This is a wartime German propaganda film celebrating the activities of the U-boat ace Reinhard Hardigan, who's died aged 105.
Kapitänleutnant Hardegen versenkte bisher 110.400 Bruttoregistertonnen, davon 58.000 Bruttoregistertonnen vor New York.
Reinhard Hardigan was the last surviving person to feature on the list of U-boat captains who destroyed more than 100,000 tons of enemy shipping. He'd started the war as a naval aviator, but after a plane crash which left him with one leg shorter than the other, he transferred to U-boats. He played a key role in attacks on the east coast of the United States in 1942. Ian Ballantyne is the author of a history of submarine warfare called The Deadly Trade.
It was called Operation Drumbeat, and it was the U-boat force seeking to capitalise on new hunting grounds off the eastern seaboard of the USA. He was actually reckoned to be the first ever German military man to see America in time of hostility during the Second World War.
When I came first time to the United States, I was far off New York, and I saw on Long Island the coast, and I saw all the lights and motor cars and so on.
They would wait for dark to fall because then they wouldn't be spotted, they hoped, by the enemy. And radar was in its infancy, so hardly any ships had surface search radar. So they would come in to the hunting grounds towards where the harbours were, and then try and spot ships, and they would try and attack them with guns or fire torpedoes on the surface. So they certainly did take advantage of the light that enabled those merchant vessels to be silhouetted.
Admiral Ernest J. King, he's a man I think to be alive today. He had 25 destroyers in the port, and he led them in the port, and all the lights were on, the lightships, no dimming. It was fascinating.
How successful was Reinhard Hardigan in those operations?
He was very successful. He managed to sink quite a few ships on both of his trips across to America, and ended up actually sinking a grand total of just over 115,000 tons of shipping across 5 patrols.
And do we know what his attitude was to the casualties who were left after he'd sunk these ships? Did he offer help to them?
The thing he said about it was that he wasn't there to attack merchant seamen or other sailors. He was actually there to attack the trade of the Allies. And like many other U-boat captains, they tried to help survivors. And, for example, Hardigan was one of those who asked a neutral ship to come across and pick up the survivors of a ship that he just sunk. So they would try where they could, but as the war wore on and the Allies became more efficient in the air and on the surface of the sea with destroyers, that possibility of staying on the surface and helping people was held to be impossible.
I've heard a story that he had lunch with Hitler once. Do you know about that?
Yeah, he did have lunch with Hitler, and if you were a U-boat ace, which meant that you sank 100,000 tons and more, you would get the honour of a medal from Adolf Hitler and also go for lunch with him. And he did say that he might have made a mistake in how outspoken he was with Hitler, because he was asked at the end of this lunch by the Führer, what do you think to the way the war's going? And Hardigan actually suggested that the Führer had got it wrong, and that actually they shouldn't be fighting on land so much, they shouldn't be looking towards the east, and that the war would be decided in the Atlantic and at sea, which of course a U-boat man would say.
And was there any repercussion for him being outspoken to the Führer like that?
No, there wasn't, because Hitler did look upon the U-boat force as an elite. So I think he gave them a certain amount of leeway when it came to speaking their minds. And Hardigan himself said that the Führer wanted to know the truth, so he told him a bit of the truth. And he was told off by some of the generals that were present at the lunch for perhaps going too far, but he didn't suffer for it.
Do we have any account of what sort of a character Reinhard Hardigan was?
Apart from being outspoken, he was a fairly humorous guy, determined. I think he took things in his stride, although he did admit that at some stages during the drumbeat patrol, he did feel rather scared and frightened when under depth charge attack from an American destroyer, and at one stage thought he would have to destroy the Enigma code materials and everything else and abandon the submarine. But he held his nerve and managed to make repairs to the submarine on the seabed, and they made it back to Germany when he got his Knight's Cross and had his lunch with the Führer.
What would have been his response to those who said that basically he was a killer? He was a man who was killing hundreds and maybe thousands of people.
He would have had to admit that. Submariners, and I've known quite a few British and other submariners, would acknowledge that their trade is to attack shipping and that people are killed. But the majority of them would say, well, I do try, although it's a terrible business and a grim business that I'm doing, I do try and save lives. But people like Nicholas Montserrat, who were on the other end of U-boats and saw the people that burned in the water and died within seconds when ships carrying iron ore went down. Some of them sank within 40 seconds, taking everybody with them. They hated the U-boats and never gave up that hatred. But people like Hardigan and Otto Kretschmer and others that survived the war had to, I'm sure, acknowledge that while they were fighting for their country and they were doing their best, they did inevitably kill people, and perhaps the cause was not the best cause.
The story of the U-boat attacks off the American coast in the early part of World War II is told in a great book called Operation Drumbeat by Michael Gannon. Well, we're going to move on now to Arthur Galion, who died recently at the age of 86, only a couple of days before his 87th birthday. And if that name is not familiar to you, try this.
A good-looking kid with the improbable name of Tab Hunter rocketed to Hollywood stardom in the early 50s. He was often on a horse, frequently without a shirt.
You don't know how rough it gets.
And he'd soon cornered the market on hysterical teenage girls.
Arthur Galion was better known as Tab Hunter, one of the biggest stars of the 50s. He was a Warner Brothers product. Warner Brothers signed him as much for his looks and his charisma as his acting, and he was sort of an adolescent version of Rock Hudson. Maybe not as good an actor, but more appealing to the teen set, especially the girls, which was ironic because, spoiler alert coming, I know you won't believe this, but Tab Hunter was gay. But putting that aside for a second, he was paired with some of Warner Brothers' biggest stars. He made his debut with Linda Darnell, who you know I love, and Linda Darnell was very nice to him. He worked with Gary Cooper, John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Sophia Loren, Rita Hayworth. And while he didn't distinguish himself, I can't say he embarrassed himself in any of those movies. In a couple, he wasn't too bad. My favorite Tab Hunter role, and maybe his most famous, is in the 1958 film adaptation of the Broadway musical Damn Yankees. He plays off of Gwen Verdon. He's Shoeless Joe from Hannibal Moe. The character's sort of modeled on Mickey Mantle. And in a locker room scene, he's with Gwen Verdon, who's playing Lola, introducing one of the most famous musical numbers on stage or screen.
Oh, we have to keep training and strict rules and all that.
You can tell me all the rules.
You're making things very complicated.
Then be good boy.
I'm trying to.
And do like Lola tells you to do. Whatever Lola wants, Lola gets.
Lola wanted him, but he didn't want Lola. But in the movie, it's not because he was gay. One of the things I like about Tab Hunter is that he never took himself too seriously. In the mid-50s, teen singers were getting big, so Tab Hunter tried his hand at recording. And he did a cover of the Sonny James classic, Young Love. We did the Sonny James podcast. Here's Tab Hunter singing Young Love on the Perry Como Show.
The heavenly touch of your embrace tells me no one can take your place ever in my heart. Young love, first love, filled with true devotion.
Well, Tab may not have been much of a singer, but that song knocked Elvis off the top spot on the Billboard charts, and that didn't bother Elvis as much as the fact that his backup singers were the Jordanaires, who were Elvis's backup singers. It bothered Jack Warner, too, because he made the record for Dot Records, which is a subsidiary of Paramount. So Jack Warner went out and started Warner Brothers Records. And Warner Brothers Records didn't do very well for 3 years. Jack Warner was about to close it down when he signed the Everly Brothers to the first $1 million contract in rock and roll. And they made Kathy's Clown as their first record for Warner Brothers, and that saved the label. And we talked about that on the Phil Everly podcast. By this point, he's squiring young girls all over Hollywood, especially Natalie Wood. He double dated a lot with Tony Perkins. They both had pretty girls on their arms. But when they went home at the end of the night, it was Tony and Tab going home together. By the way, they both played Jimmy Pearsall, Tony Perkins, of course, in Fear Strikes Out, and Tab Hunter played him in the television remake. We did the Jimmy Pearsall podcast I referred to. Let's just say I'm not sure how Jimmy would have reacted to this. Anyway, by 1959, the studio system was dying, and Tab Hunter was one of the casualties. He and Warner Brothers couldn't get together on a new contract, so they replaced him with a younger guy. Troy Donahue was 5 years younger, sort of like what they did to the female stars. Tried out for the film version of West Side Story, didn't get it. Tab had a short-lived TV show, did a bunch of marginal movies, went to Europe for a while, did some dinner theater. Looked like his career was over, but he had a career revival in 1981 when camp director John Waters got him to star opposite Divine in Polyester.
It's Todd, honey.
Todd?
Todd tomorrow?
I remember when he said yes, I went berserk. I was like calling every person in the world. I was like running, like I won the lottery. I was running up and down the street. I couldn't believe that Tab Hunter was going to come to Baltimore and be in our movie. And Divine was over the moon. Never, ever did I want to make fun of Tab Hunter's career. I wanted Tab to make fun of it with me, the idea of this image, which he seemed happy to be.
He had a second career with camp movies. He would have done more with John Waters, but Divine died a couple years after that. And by the 1990s, Tab Hunter had retired from films. Let me just say in closing in Tab Hunter that he was quite an interesting guy. And in fact, his 2005 autobiography, Tab Hunter Confidential, is one of the best movie autobiographies I've ever read. I highly recommend it for anybody who wants to read about the studio system of the 50s, what it was like living a double life, hiding your sexuality in those days, or just insights into famous movie stars of that era. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with Eugene Pitt, who died recently at the age of 80. Eugene Pitt was the lead singer of one of the last great doo-wop groups, doo-wop being the street corner music you heard in New York City and Philadelphia primarily in the late 50s and early 60s. Eugene Pitt's group was the Jive Five. And in 1961, Eugene Pitt wrote one of the great doo-wop classics, and it was actually one of the last great doo-wop classics. I have a soft spot in my heart for Eugene Pitt for two reasons. He was a nice African-American boy born in Brooklyn, and he grew up in Brownsville, my dad's neighborhood, only a couple of blocks from where my dad grew up at Pitkin and Hopkinson. And he was also a big-time Green Bay Packer fan because his cousin was Elijah Pitts, one of the great Packer running backs from the 1960s. He was a nice guy and a great interview. And as I said, he wrote a doo-wop classic, My True Story, about his girlfriend. It was number one on the R&B charts in 1961. It made it into the top 10 in the overall pop charts. So as a final tribute to Eugene Pitt, let's take a listen to a little bit of My True Story, a song that heralded the end of doo-wop, soon to be replaced by surf music, Motown, and ultimately the Beatles and the British invasion.
Gene Pitt and the Jive Five.
It was back in 1960 when I fell in love. But by falling in love, I wrote this song. For your listening pleasure, I give to you, ladies and gentlemen, my true story. There is a story